Chapter 19, Solomon Sheker, Master of Disinformation. Why can we not be equally tolerant of the conservative and reform movements and their clergy? Tolerance does not extend to fraud. Rabbi David B. Hollander. Sheker in Hebrew means deceit, and this can be applied to Solomon Schechter, 1847 to 1915, the Marxist-Frankist boy wonder disciple of Jelinek, Weiss, and Company, upon whom America's so-called Jewish conservative movement was built. His admirers stated he was its chief architect. The foundations of Solomon's Temples of Doom were his teachings, spread through his essays in both hardcover and paperback, such as Studies in Judaism, some aspects of Rabbinic Theology, and seminary addresses and other papers. The bulk of this work is studded with references to his Marxist-Frankist teachers, especially Weiss. Thus, the contemporary conservative and Masorati, or conservative in Israel, movements are based not only on the antinomian pagan satanic Frankists' Sufi doctrines, but on their falsehoods and fake scholarship, hence the play on the word sheker, or deceit, to designate Schechter. The conspiracy to implant the conservative movement in America was masterminded by the Illuminati and implemented by Austrian, English, and American Frankists. The Savation Illuminati plans for America were formulated in these stages. 1. Develop a scholar image for Solomon Schechter. 2. Establish a theological seminary for Schechter as a breeding ground for spreading their nefarious doctrines and to provide clergy for their temples. 3. Establish a network of antinomian temples offering a wide spectrum of practices stretching wall to wall from temples having some orthodox features to those with reform practices in order to lead Jews eventually towards total assimilation. 4. Develop a disinformation network to spread lies about Judaism, especially that Judaism has branches or streams. 5. Promote the disillusion of the purity of the halakhic family by sabotaging the divorce procedures to produce proliferate illegitimate offspring, and the conversion procedures to promote Gentiles into the Jewish community. 6. Promote and implement universal Illuminati Gnostic goals, especially internationalism, undermining Jewish nationalism. 7. Establish a synagogue council to assist the growth of the movement. 8. Develop an organized phony rabbinical society. 9. Through clout and disinformation, promote the conservative movement so it may interface with umbrella organizations that will succeed in ultimately destroying the integrity of the halakhic synagogue by pressuring such synagogues into joining them. 10. Do likewise for its phony conservative rabbinate by promoting umbrella boards of rabbis to include the phony and legitimate rabbi. And 11. Direct a campaign of libel against religious Jews and their practices to discredit them as not modern and out of touch with the times. Every one of these goals was accomplished. Schechter spearheaded the United Synagogue of America, founded in 1913. The Rabbinic Assembly of the Conservative Movement was founded in 1901 by graduates of the Jewish Theological Seminary of America. The United Synagogue and Reform organizations clobbered and conned the Union of Orthodox Jewish Congregations of America to join the umbrella organization Synagogue Council of America, which capitulated and was condemned by every single authentic rabbinic decisor of Jewish law throughout the world. These rabbis also opposed the participation by authentic rabbis with the phony rabbis on joint boards, such as the New York Board of Rabbis. Schechter was given a scholarly image and eventually was appointed the head of the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, originally an authentic Jewish rabbinic institution that was pirated by the American Frankists under Jacob Schiff's leadership and debased to its present state. Here is the inside story of Schechter's rise to prominence and the pirating of the seminary. Solomon Schechter was born in the Carpathian Mountains in December 1847 in the town of Foscani, Romania, to Yitzchak and Kaya Schechter, devout Chabad Hasidism. The shamus of the Foscani synagogue claimed that Schechter, in his youth, was the wildest boy in town, but exhibited signs of genius. Accordingly, Sheker left Foscani at the age of 10 for the yeshiva at the neighboring town of Pietra. After studying there, he continued his studies in Faltaseni. Now, there lived in Foscani a crypto-Haskalah devotee who lent Sheker, in secret, secular books, some of which were heretical to Judaism, which influenced Sheker away from being a devout Jew. At 16, Sheker entered the Lemberg Yeshiva directed by Rabbi Yosef Shaul Nathanson. After this, he returned to Foscani. Sheker's personality began to gel as a paradigm of utilizing antagonistically diverse factors, ranging from history, the then-infant sociology, anthropology, and socialism, cloaking them in a veneer as helpmates to traditional Judaism in order to undermine Jewish Torah authority, which he facilitated with a hefty measure of fraud. Meanwhile, he married a pious young lady in Foscani. The marriage lasted a year. At 24, he permanently left Foscani for an odyssey into the centers of scholarly heresy. He entered the Bet HaMidrash in Vienna, where he received their phony ordination, Hatarat Hora, in 1879 from I.H. Weiss. Sheker was an amateur Talmudist and never made any direct contribution to halakha, and had no outstanding future among yeshiva rabbis. While at the Bet HaMidrash, Sheker wrote 2 attacks against Hasidic Judaism under aliases, Words Sweet as Honey and Talks of Those Golden Sprouts, which appeared in HaShakar. The publication of these articles provides real insight into Sheker's true character. Let us consider the following passage in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 23, verses 4 and 5. An Ammonite and Moabite shall not enter into the assembly of the Lord forever, because they met you not with bread and water on the path when you came out of Egypt, and because they hired Balaam to curse you. The Ammonites and Moabites were descendants of Lot, Genesis chapter 19, verses 36 through 38, whose very existence was dependent on the kindness and mercy of Lot's uncle Abraham, who had also risked his life to save him, Genesis 14. We learn from this that God expected from the pagans who were involved in the worst immorality an ethical appreciation of indebtedness. Sheker's public attack on his own roots reveals the true crassness of his character lying below the thin external veneer of his feigned scholarship. After Vienna, Sheker proceeded to Berlin to study at the Hochschule für die Wissenschaft des Studentums, Geiger's seminary, described previously in Chapter 7, which followed the spirit of communist Sabatian Frankist Leopold Zunz. Indeed, Sheker kept a picture of Zunz in his study and considered him his godfather. Geiger died in 1874 and was succeeded in his reform preaching capacity and his teaching at the Hochschule by Dr. Pinchas Frankl, a member of the Frankist-dominated Vienna Israelite Alliance, where he served as its secretary. The alliance was the philanthropic arm of the Viennese Jewish community. Sheker lived in Frankl's house in Berlin. While studying at the Hochschule, Sheker simultaneously enrolled at the University of Berlin in its Faculty of Philosophy, 1879 to 1882. In Berlin, Sheker met Claude Montefiore, 1858 to 1938, an ultra-reform rabbi who subscribed to Marxist Illuminist principles. Claude was a scion of the House of Montefiore, a grandnephew of Sir Moses Montefiore, 1784 to 1885, who fought against reform and was a religiously observant Jew. Claude was also the great-grandson of Meyer Amschel Rothschild, whose daughter Henrietta married Moses Montefiore's brother Abraham. Moses' wife Judy, born Cohen, had a sister, Hannah, who married Nathan Meyer Rothschild, 1777 to 1835, of London. It was Claude who would, with Sheker as his high priest, initiate Sheker into his ultimate life's destiny. Accordingly, Claude hired Sheker as his tutor, and they left for England in 1882. Montefiore's coordinator with the Illuminati was Platonist Benjamin Jewett, who was busy liberalizing Christianity. Jewett recruited Montefiore to communicate Jewish source material, which he could twist as interpreter of Judaism to the Christian world. Jewett was founder of the Broad Church movement in England and directly influenced the radicals Asquith, Gray, and Curzon. A ploy that they utilized to undermine religious authority was the promotion of the concept of moral relativism, which was abetted by Sir James G. Fraser's works. Montefiore and Israel Abrahams launched in 1888 the Jewish Quarterly Review, which acts as a repository to this very day of articles dealing with Jewish subject matter written in academic summary style. Sheker later transplanted the review to the United States. Of all of the goals of the Illuminati, it appears that Claude Montefiore was most preoccupied with the Illuminati's goals of merging religions, and more particularly, Judaism and Christianity. He tried to prevent the Balfour Declaration from being signed and publicly condemned the establishment of a Jewish state. It was Jews such as these that were excommunicated by Rabbi A.Y. Cook, the first chief rabbi of Israel under the British Mandate. Rabbi Cook had left Israel for England on a mission and was forced to remain there until the end of World War I. Rabbi Cook's excommunication edict was written in Yiddish and was conspicuously posted on all Jewish institutions throughout Great Britain. Under Claude Montefiore's guidance and sponsorship, Sheker rose to prominence in British society, finding prestige in London, 1882 to 1890, and the halls of Oxford and then Cambridge, 1890 to 1902. As Sheker's reputation grew, he chose the company of similar spirits who were out to undermine and destroy religious authority, such as Sir James George Fraser, author of The Golden Bough, Folklore of the Old Testament, and other works in the area of comparative religion and anthropology, who influenced people to regard their religious practices as superstitions of pagan origin. Thus, as far as Fraser was concerned, kosher food was merely the outgrowth of tribal folk taboos, as opposed to commandments of God to Israel to be a holy nation commanded not to defile yourselves. In England, Montefiore groomed Sheker for entry into the proper circles. Since Sheker was a mediocre Talmudist, Montefiore schemed to build up Sheker's scholastic image. Sheker spent 8 years in London, 1882 to 1890, and 12 years in Oxford and Cambridge, 1890 to 1902, pursuing research at the British Museum. He married Matilda Roth on June 22, 1887, whom the author suspects was from a Frankist Asiatic Brethren family from Breslau. In Cambridge, Sheker was a university lecturer and reader in Talmud and interfaced with the leading radical Illuminists of his day. Since Sheker had been cut out to attract religious Jews away from Judaism, he maintained a facade of concern for the Torah and Judaism, often taking public positions against Montefiore. Here and there, however, Sheker would let something subtly slip out, such as his invitation to Israel Zangwill in 1891, quoted in Bentwich's book. "Come and stay next Sabbath. We could then have a talk about Shabbatai Zevi, about whom I intend one day to write an essay under the title of The Theological Bubble." Actually, Zangwill was a communist. Evidence for this is to be found in the papers of Joseph Fels, preserved in the archives of the Pennsylvania Historical Society in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Fels was a major financier of the Bolsheviks. Fels' fortune came from the soap Fels Naphtha, and he endowed the Fels planetariums. In order to propel Sheker to fame, Montefiore and company conceived of a plan to have Sheker do work on the Cairo Genizah. Jews do not destroy holy books. They are either buried or consigned to a place called a Genizah, where they are stored for posterity. Cairo had such a Genizah, famous among Jews, not well known to the general public. There were many investigations of Genizah fragments in the 19th century, and they are discussed in the Encyclopedia Judaica. However, Sheker went to Cairo. The established authorities at Cambridge University Library sent Sheker to Egypt in 1896. Media-hype photographs showed him sitting with a dust mask, deciphering fragments ranging from codices to apocryphal fragments of the poet Ben Sira. It is interesting to note that J.D. Eisenstein, the editor of the Hebrew Encyclopedia Otzar Yisrael, states about Genizah research. Nothing good ever came of this research, and it is a fact that if scholars would spend the same time interpreting manuscripts in libraries instead of wasting time with abandoned fragments of the Genizah, they could bring a multiplicity of excellence to Hebrew literature. Further proof that Sheker's Genizah work was a sham is apparent from the fact that he misfiled fragments of Anan ben David's Sefer HaMitzvah, or Book of Commandments. Anan ben David founded the Karaite schism in the 8th century. To this very day, the Karaites use Anan's book as their guide. Every Karaite house in Cairo, of which there were several thousand, had the book. Sheker was such an ignoramus, he did not even know that he could get a copy of the book and use it to organize the fragments. The conservative movement is fortunate that their membership's Jewish knowledge is less than their so-called rabbis. The entire American movement today is based on the myth of Sheker's scholarship, and their chain of Hebrew day schools is named for Sheker. So today, Sheker's Sefer HaMitzvot edition stands out as the misrepresentation it is of a fraudulent anti-Judaic religion masquerading as a branch of Judaism. Later on, Sheker provided funds to publish a forgery of lost manuscripts of the Jerusalem Talmud. There are those who claim he thought it was genuine and was duped. There are others who maintain he did this as part of the conspiracy to undermine Judaism. Those who subscribe to the former view must, by necessity, agree that if he was fooled by the manuscripts, he can now claim fame to scholarship, since there were scores of rabbis who spotted the forgery, such as Chief Rabbi Ritter of Rotterdam and the Ridbaz. Having achieved his media glory, Sheker was ready to assume the lead role as head of the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, of which historian Max Diamont once quipped at a lecture, "That is where Orthodox rabbis train conservative rabbis for Reform congregations." Mishkan Tefillah, Newton, Massachusetts, Spring Lecture Series, 1969. Sheker arrived in the United States in 1902 to continue his job of destroying more Jews. The seminary was really originally an Orthodox institution founded by two rabbis who hated Reform and the New Wave conservative historical school with a passion. These rabbis also had university credentials and doctorates and were very sophisticated. They were the dean, Sabado Marias, 1829 to 1897, rabbi of the Sephardic Spanish-Portuguese congregation Mikveh Yisrael in Philadelphia, and Bernard Drachman, June 27, 1861 to 1945, who served as assistant dean. They founded the seminary in 1886, and it was located at 736 Lexington Avenue in Manhattan. Rabbi Drachman's story is fascinating. Unlike Rabbi Marias, who was born in Italy, Drachman was born in the United States in Newark, New Jersey. He was earmarked to be a Reform cleric and was sent abroad to study in Germany so he might one day become the rabbi of Reform Congregation Temple Emmanuel in New York. In Germany, he discovered Jews who practiced Judaism and became a Baal Teshuvah, a repentant Jew, and became religious, receiving ordination from Rabbi Manuel Joel, 1826 to 1890. When he died in 1945, he was president of the prestigious Union of Orthodox Jewish Congregations of America. He and Rabbi Marias planned to ordain sophisticated and articulate American religious rabbis who would overwhelm the heretical movements. After the death of Rabbi Marias in 1897, Jacob Schiff conspired to take over the seminary and control it. He hired Sheker, who appointed heretical professors to teach there. Rabbi Drachman, seeing the changes that occurred, could no longer stomach it and left. Schiff spent $200,000 to build a new building for the seminary on West 123rd Street, where it stands to this present day. The seminary grew to be the center of the conservative movement in America, and many new conservative congregations proliferated in America, especially after World War I. These congregations had mixed pews where men and women sat together during services, which is considered a pagan practice in Judaism. For prayer and revelation in Judaism are dialogues with God. In revelation, God begins the dialogue. In prayer, man begins the dialogue. Since the mass revelation at Mount Sinai took place under the condition of separation of the sexes, Exodus 19:15, prayer likewise demands this. Furthermore, after the revelation, it was clear that man could not, in egalitarian fashion, pray to God as he pleased. God makes the rules. In every place where I cause my name to be mentioned, I will come to you and bless you. Exodus 20:21. It does not say where you cause my name to be mentioned. Among the heretical seminary faculty members was Louis Ginsburg. He was appointed professor of Talmud and Rabbinics at the Jewish Theological Seminary in 1901. Ginsburg's career started to come to an end in 1948. In 1953, Ginsburg died shortly after receiving a letter calling him to task for his improprieties with Judaism. This is discussed in a book by his son. Here is the letter. Levi of Niedstadt, your life has been a failure. Not only have you made the Torah a shovel to dig dirt, and you glory in the designation of professor of Talmud and great authority on halakha, when you know that there are scores of men superior to you in Talmud in this city. Not only have you helped produce rabbis who, in almost every single case, lie carnally with menstruous women, are sinners, and cause the public to sin. Not only are you a deserter of the real Talmudic scholars, but you have cast aspersion on the Talmud and supported the heretics. You declared at least twice, once in your legends and once in your studies, etc., that the rabbis of the Talmud uttered their Haggadah statements on the spur of the moment. May the Almighty forgive you. And you support Weiss in his denial of the authenticity of a great part of the oral law. Your works are full of echoes of the heretics. Remember your childhood hopes, and now see yourself not only as an associate of M. Kaplan, Yamak Shemo, but also in part responsible for him and for others like him. For you, the authority, have undermined the faith of these ignoramuses. May the Almighty open your eyes and help you to recant, to recall the harmful books, to repudiate your associates, the heretics, and to return to the community of Talmudic scholars. Yours sincerely, a friend. Prior to coming to the seminary, Ginsburg wanted to join the Reform Seminary. One of the ironies of the Reform movement in the United States was that its laymen were more religious than its leaders. This is shown by an incident described in Keeper of the Law, pages 61 through 63, which, incidentally, proves that in the United States, the mindset of conservatism is more or less equal to reform. Ginsburg applied for a job at the Reform Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, Ohio. Reform cleric Isaac M. Wise, 1819 to 1900, approved the hiring of Ginsburg. However, the Board of Governors refused to hire him since he did not believe that the Torah was written by God and since he subscribed to biblical criticism. They considered him too liberal in thought and too conservative in his behavior because he kept kosher. From the time Sheker came to the United States, most of the seminary faculty indulged in disinformation. They are more dangerous than the Reform because they put on the facade of being religious, cloaking their pronouncements with a veil of authenticity as if conforming to halakha. The seminary, over the course of the years, had two outstanding Talmudic scholars who they bought for a price, Saul Lieberman and David Weiss Halivni. Both were asked for their opinion on ordaining women in the conservative movement, and they said it was against Jewish law. Of course, the male rabbis, with a few rare exceptions who, like Rabbi Drachman, returned to Judaism, were heretics. In any event, the conservatives ignored their window-dressing decisors. Halivni, however, was furious and resigned from the seminary. The editor of Tradition, a journal of Orthodox Jewish thought, discusses this in a book review. Sheker, or deceit, permeates the movement. Arthur Herzberg, however, was nauseated by his colleagues invoking halakha, declaring that the conservatives should stop the practice because we are living in a post-halachic era. While his remarks are heretical, they are at least less fraudulent than those of his colleagues. The conservative movement, by its very existence, perpetrates the lie that they are a branch of Judaism, when indeed they are anti-Judaic. Their members are, nevertheless, invariably Jews. The problem is that since their conversions are fraudulent, counterfeit rabbis take authentic Christians and convert them to counterfeit Jews. This practice is subject to a critical novel, Migrant Soul, by Rabbi Avi Shafran. Perhaps more accurately, their members are duped into being Jews for Satan. Incidentally, Sheker, like Karl Marx, sported a dual-shaped beard popular among Satanists. Every conservative tract read by this author in the last 30 years is replete with deceit and disinformation, starting with their book Tradition and Change. Here is a collection of some of their deceit. 1. The sainted Rabbi Aaron Kotler, who was a sworn enemy of theirs, was invoked by William Berkowitz to raise money for the conservative congregation B'nai Yeshurun on Manhattan's West Side. A protest by Agudat Israel stopped it. 2. The movement rewrote history. Their literature now features their enemy, Rabbi Marias, as a conservative rabbi since he founded the seminary. This is stated in Tradition and Change. 3. The movement's press is called the Burning Bush Press, symbolizing the Illuminati. Sheker conceived of this symbol and tied it to a prayer, twisting it to mean that the Sharet Israel, the remnant of Israel, the New Age Jew, would survive because of the Shomer Israel, or Watcher of Israel, who was supposed to be God, but in Sheker's theosophy is the all-seeing eye. The hippie-era Hatorah movement, affiliated with the conservatives, display a pyramid and eye Illuminati symbol on their literature. 4. The pagan festival American Indian Day is celebrated in Solomon Schechter schools. 5. Homosexual marriage is considered a legitimate minority position in the movement headed by cleric Bradley Artson. 6. Their law committee left it to individual rabbis to determine whether lesbians and gay men can be active youth leaders and teachers in the movement, and there is a responsum accepted by the movement that maintains that engaging in homosexual behavior is not an abomination. 7. Their women's organization supports abortion on demand. 8. The first inroads into feminism beyond the first mixed pew congregations occurred in 1977 when Mrs. Ruth Perry, daughter of conservative cleric Reuben McGill, was called up to the Torah. And 9. The dean of the seminary's rabbinical school was forced to resign because of a sex scandal, and interestingly, he was opposed to the gay and lesbian faction of the movement. It should be mentioned that after the demise of Jacob Schiff, his relatives by marriage, the Warburgs, became the primary financiers of the seminary. This is the family that financed the rebuilding of certain parts of Germany after the war, such as Frankfurt. Most prominent was Frederick M. Warburg, son of Felix, October 14, 1897, to July 10, 1973. The family turned over a Warburg mansion to be used as a Jewish museum. The family that had aided Hitler in his rise to power dreamed of a museum where one could display the religious artifacts of Judaism, the religion which would eventually be extinct according to the plan to eliminate the opiate. The museum is under the aegis of the seminary. The duplicity of the conservative movement gave rise to a multiplicity of responsa. For example, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein ruled that a conservative cleric is prohibited when entering an authentic synagogue from leading the service in responsive prayer, which ordinary laymen commonly do. Rabbi Aaron Soloveitchik states, if one is a conservative rabbi and he has complete faith in both written and oral law and is stringent in the observance of light mitzvah as with weighty ones, assuming this is possible, and he is a great scholar, thoroughly versed in Talmud and decisors, but he is a rabbi in a conservative congregation, and he is a member of the conservative movement, he is ineligible to be a member of a tribunal dealing with conversion and the like. If a Gentile man or woman converts in such a tribunal, then we must effect another conversion. This was also applied to divorce procedures and weddings. Cousin Kadish Goldberg of Israel, who translated this from Hebrew to write the following limerick concerning the conservative movement. Pity poor proselyte Yvette went and got a conservative get. Reb Aaron gave void, der Rabbi Smitka is void, Mamzerim is all she'll beget. This would apply even to the late Saul Lieberman. However, Lieberman eventually acquiesced to the heresy of praying in mixed pew temples, as when he attended a bar mitzvah in Kehelat Israel, Brookline, Massachusetts. As time went on and decisors struggled with the weighty problems of Jewish law and this movement, And the rabbis pointed to the accepted norm that subtracting from the Torah is equivalent to idolatry. It was discovered that key figures at the seminary were advocating actual idolatry and were involved with Eastern religions. After the late president of the Rabbinical Council of America, Rabbi Louis Bernstein, pointed this out in an attack in the Jewish press, the seminary chancellor accepted the idolatry and did nothing, leading to a second attack by Rabbi Bernstein.